In this video session, we're going to cover, in a little more detail, the rater errors and biases that might negatively influence a selection interview. We are also going to cover some of the strategies that can be used to offset the effect of these rater errors. As recruitment professionals, we want to make sure the processes we use to select people are as fair and unbiased as possible. In order to do that, we need to make sure that first, we are aware of what these errors are, and two, then implement the strategies to overcome them. So first, I'd like to begin by talking in some detail about the types of rater errors that exist in selection interviews. The first type of error I want to talk about is halo. This error is quite common among selection interviewers, and it's when we apply specific good information we learn about somebody more generally to other categories as we progress through the selection interview. The opposite of this is horn, and this is perhaps even more of a concern for a selection interviewer. Because we have a tendency to highly rate negative information, when we learn something negative about someone, it can adversely affect how we assess all other components and information that we learn about this person. So horn is probably more of a concern than halo, although both errors are present during the selection interview. Another error that is quite common is similar to me, and that is we tend to like people who are like us. And indeed, research has shown that this can be based on even minor characteristics. So for example, if somebody has the first name as me, if they went to the same school as me, I'm much more likely to rate that person favorably because of those characteristics. Another type of error that exists in rater interviews is contrast effect. And contrast effect is really about making relative rather than absolute assessments of an applicant. What I mean is, if I interview somebody and they are really strong, the next applicant I see, I might rate as below average, even though their performance was average, just because they have the bad misfortune of following somebody who did really well. Obviously, this can also work in reverse. If I interview somebody who did very poorly, and the next applicant I get is average, I may see this person as above average because I'm comparing them to the previous applicant, rather than an objective set of performance criteria based on the position. Another type of error is central tendency, and this is when raters do not use the full rating scale that's available to them. And this can happen for a number of reasons. First, it's often difficult for a selection generalist to conduct an interview and rate somebody on characteristics of a position if they're not really familiar with that specific position. That is, they don't know really what constitutes very good or very poor performance. The other reason is that it's simply easier to rate people as average because as selection interviewers, I often don't have to rationalize or justify an average assessment. I only have to rationalize or justify either extremely good or extremely bad ones. Another form of error is what is beautiful is good. That is, the effects of appearance on the interview or on the interviewer. Within our society, we have a tendency to believe that people who are attractive are also smart and more qualified or better at doing things, that is, more generally successful in life than people who are less attractive. And indeed, research has shown that if you have two applicants who've applied for a position, one is attractive and unqualified, one is unattractive and qualified, the attractive person will almost always be offered the position and they will be given a higher rate of pay. So we need to be aware that these types of errors can influence our overall assessment of an applicant. So what can we do to ensure that our selection interviews are as fair and unbiased as possible? Well, here are some strategies that organizational psychologists have found can be very effective. Perhaps most importantly, when you're conducting selection interviews, it's important to recognize that these errors and biases exist. Simply being aware that they exist will counter the effects that they will have on the selection process. So if you're in charge of a group of recruiters or people doing selection interviews, it would be important for you to ensure that they all have some exposure to rater error or bias training before they conduct the interviews. Next, avoid first impression biases. That is, you want to make sure that you avoid having things like similar to me or appearance affecting the overall quality of your assessment. So you need to be aware of things like is the person's educational background or where they're from or their appearance affecting the way I might be making my overall assessments. So to counter this, it might be worthwhile asking yourself a couple of questions. Am I rating this person based on the qualifications for this position, or am I being influenced by their level of attractiveness or that they have similar characteristics or qualities that I also have? When conducting a selection interview, it's important to know what knowledge, skills, and abilities are important for the position that you're interviewing. As a generalist, this can pose a number of challenges. You need to ensure that when you ask questions or that when you are developing questions for the selection interview, that they are based on the knowledge, skills, and abilities that relate to a specific position. There's a number of ways that you can go about doing this. Perhaps the easiest is to take a look at a job description and see what kind of skills, knowledge, and abilities are required to do this job well. This in and of itself is very helpful, and it can provide it can allow you to identify the questions that are necessary for you to make a fair assessment for this position. The next most important thing is to provide or identify some kind of rating scale that will enable you to make differing levels of assessment based on the applicant's performance or responses to these questions. To do this, it is often helpful if you can either talk to somebody who's already doing that job and they can help you identify what type of skills or would qualify as average, above average, or below average performance. If somebody isn't available who's currently doing that job, talk to a manager or do some additional research around your organization, and you should be able to identify differing levels of performance. This process is called developing an anchored rating scale. Anchored rating scales are very helpful when determining comparative assessments for applicants. Next, it's very important when conducting selection interviews that there's some record of the types of things you're using to make an assessment. Obviously, if you're using a structured interview approach and you develop questions and anchors, this process becomes very, very simple. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. If you find yourself in a situation where you may have not been given an interviewing script or anchored rating scales, you want to ensure that you use the same questions, that you record what the applicant's responses are to these questions, so that you can then make a fair comparative analysis afterwards. As I mentioned, structured interviewing is probably the easiest way to increase the overall validity of the selection interview process. That is, making it as valid as possible and selecting candidates who will do well in the position. You can do that by selecting questions that are based on criteria directly related to the job, and by developing anchored rating scales that are firmly bound to performance criteria, that is, they allow you to identify high and low performances so that you can use the full range of the rating scale when making your comparative assessments. Make absolute rather than relative assessments. You want to ensure that when you're conducting your selection interview, that you are comparing the applicant's responses to a set number of criteria that are based on the position and not on the responses of the previous applicant. Finally, don't assume that you're going to get a mixture of very poor and very good applicants for this position. Remember that screening has already taken place that has removed many of the weaker candidates from this application process. As a result, you're going to want to ensure that the performance criteria that you're using to make your assessments still allow you to be broad enough to distinguish between good and poor performers at this level. To accomplish this, using structured interviews with an anchored rating scale is often a very effective way of ensuring that you're sampling the criteria that are related to the position and still maintaining a rating scale that provides you with the breadth to distinguish between good and poor performers. I hope you have found this information useful, and I wish you all the best on your future selection interviews.